Okay, welcome back. Today I am giving an overview of a construction I completed recently, and this is basically a patch board that I created to use in conjunction with two Folktek modules. The one is the Conduit, which is a very innovative module that includes delay, filter, tone generation, and then a module that's very useful if you have any Folktek, and that's the Conduit. And you can also use it with Matter, which is their drum synthesizer. And basically this allows you, if you add this module on, which is totally passive, and you're hearing some of the sounds of it today actually. But with this passive module, basically you can use it to attenuate and control a lot of the parameters on this particular module or Matter as well. And so what I thought I'd do today is to just take you through this idea of why I created this patch board and how it functions, and maybe bigger picture, how this fits in with experimental music and particularly the Eurorack world that allows for some of these sonic and modulation experiments that you wouldn't normally get to engage in, say, in the world of semi-modular or traditional like synthesizers, VSTs, and so forth. I think right now I'll just turn down. You're hearing the tone generation coming from the Conduit, so I'm just going to turn down that a little bit so it's easier to hear. So when I first heard about Folktek, if you know about the company, it's really, when I think of the world of modular, you know, they come to mind as a company that has kind of that mad scientist approach in terms of Arias Blaze, what he does, the experimental devices that they create, ranging from, say, the Resonant Garden to many of these modules here. And I think very generally what they do is they release often some of these in limited runs. And so it's the kind of thing, if you want one of these, you often have to pick it up if you can find them. They're maybe not as easy to find on some of your favorite electronic music store sites. I happen to pick up both Conduit and Resist for a very good price on Reverb.com, and I'm doing a lot of selling myself on Reverb, and I pick up a lot of used modules. In fact, most of my modules I think I've gotten through Reverb.com or some other used sources, getting demo models from Perfect Circuit Audio or places like that. So it's a great way actually to pick up some decent modules. And one of the things in the future I'm doing, you should check out my getting into Eurorack video, but one of the things I'll mention because there's a strong community movement within the Eurorack community, people I think generally take great care of their modules. And one of the things when you buy online, often people will talk about whether there's a rack rash, which comes from mounting your modules. And so some of us mount them with washers of various sorts that protect the modules in case you want to resell them. So I've had some really good luck, and this again was purchased used on Reverb.com. So when you think about Folktek, if you know about any of their more recent creations, they're releasing, or I think have released, Mescaline, which is really curious and combines some of these elements in terms of patching. We'll talk about the DuPont cables and how those come into play in this module. But what I like about Folktek is they do very, very innovative stuff. The other company that comes to mind, they do have one Eurorack module, but you know, mostly it's outboard gear, and that is Soma, based out of Moscow, and also very experimental. This is their new pipe, which I just happened to get in the mail. I'm very excited to try it out, and I hope to do a video in the future showing you some of the sounds of this very cool instrument. So I think along with Folktek, you know, there are companies like Soma that I think really push the boundaries of electronic music, allowing us to do some new things, particularly for those of us who like harsh sounds or the ability to experiment with noise or modulation that sometimes will take your audio or your music into a realm of perhaps the avant-garde or experimentalism. Then these sorts of devices I think are really key for us as we think about creating some of our musical experiments. So in any case, when I got the Folktek, I knew what I was getting into. I had heard some sound demos, and I thought this is really going to fit into my system. It's going to do a lot of things for me. It's going to allow me to use it as an effects unit with a delay, allow me to use the filter, It will also allow me, because of the tone generation possibilities up here at the top of the module, to do some really curious things in terms of creating sound itself, whether it's part of using the delay or sort of on its own as its own sound source that I can further manipulate through clouds or any of my other modules. Of course, there are many CV points in and out on here, so it allows you to experiment with controlling a lot of the parameters on the unit. When I got the unit, though, it occurred to me, so I basically set it up in my system, and I immediately thought, how is it going to work with these DuPont cables? These, of course, are used by a lot of people in the Arduino community, people who do a lot of coding, a lot of DIY electronics. They're really useful. They're pretty durable, and they're also pretty cheap. You can get like hundreds of these for a few bucks on Amazon or your favorite site. And certainly there's other gear out there that uses these type of DuPont patch cables. But the thing about it I noticed immediately is when I started doing some of the patching, and basically how this particular module works is you have a tone generator up here, an output, you have a delay unit here, a delay input, you have a filter side here, you have Vactrals, which basically do modulation via light, so you get some really interesting sounds. And the patching itself is pretty complex. I'm not going to do an overview actually of this module. And if you're curious about that, you can check out Folktek's YouTube videos. A lot of other people have done some really good videos on this particular unit. I have to say that one of the cool things about Folktek is that when you get a module, and I'm sure this is the case with their outboard gear as well, there's a lot of stuff that maybe isn't immediately clear to you in terms of how to use it, how to do some of the patching, how to attenuate, and so forth. And I actually like that because it gives you that sense, kind of like with the Soma gear I mentioned, the pipe that I was just showing you. There's a lot of room for growth and experimentation, and not everything is known to you up front. Contrast that, say, with a VST. You plug in your keyboard. It's kind of like what you see is what you get. You play the patch, maybe you can modulate it, but it's nothing like this. And so my attraction to this was the fact that it did have this patching system. If you think about a typical modular system, we're already familiar with patching in our cables of various lengths. And, we use this to create some incredibly interesting sounds. So this is doing that within one module. So you think of, if you are really into patching and altering your sound and coming up with unexpected moments, then I think a unit like this is really incredible because it allows you to do some things that you can't do with other modules that are out there. That being said, when I got the unit, I started playing with the DuPont cables. I made a few simple patches, and the ones that come with it are a lot smaller actually, so these are way bigger because I modified this for my own setup. But basically, when you start patching those, as you get these close together, and maybe we'll zoom in here a little bit. Okay, so when you're, what happens is when you start to patch these, they're just the holes, the slots that they go in are really small. And I don't know, it's one of those things that like, it's just really hard to do some of the patching. So I thought, well, since this really is just serving a purpose of, conductivity, connecting one point to the next, what if I created something based on every one of these patch points, and I basically created this patch board, and this is kind of what I did and why I'm showing you this in the video. So essentially what I thought then was, what if I took each one of these points and then connected it to something metallic, and then use my own patching system to make things a little bit easier. So instead of putting these tiny DuPont cables in, I could bypass that and use essentially alligator clips. And you'll note immediately, and I'll give you some sounds in a second, but just one clip starts to change the sound of it. So I'll turn up the volume. And you kind of can see immediately, you can get some really harsh tones with Conduit. And of course, if you have resist alongside it, it gives you so much more control over the tone generation or other aspects, depending on how you patch things. Just turn that down for a second. So my thought was, okay, all I have to do, and it actually was kind of an undertaking, is connect each of these points to the points on the back. And I'm trying to remember, I think there were close to maybe it was something like 89 of these. I'm trying to remember the total number of points. But I'll show you an image here of the back as well. It's kind of hard for me to flip this around. So what I did was I just took 2 pieces of wood and I basically laid out all of the various blocks on the conduit up here. So essentially I have all the tone generation here, which mirrors these. You can't really see it too well, but it mirrors the little DuPont inserts there. I have on this side here the 2 VCA Vactrals on basically the left side and the right side. I have the delay input, which is up there, and that's mirrored down here. And then I also have a few of the other outputs that allow you to create some of the patching. So as I started to do this, I realized like it, A, it's a big undertaking, but B, it really did allow me to think, not just it gave me an opportunity to not have to fuss with such small points of contact in which to work. It's just really hard, I think, to fit your fingers in there. You already have this issue if you do some patching with your typical patch cables. You often have a situation where if your modules are too close together, you get into situations where you can't, the modules here don't really give you a good example of this, but you've been into a situation where you have a bunch of patch cables plugged in and you can't access some of your modulation knobs. You can't control some of the parameters on your synth, on your VCA, on your VCO, whatever it is that you're using. So, in a sense, it was similar to this. I had just had trouble patching things. But the other thing, when I created this, I realized that almost immediately it was more visually explanatory, if you will. It allowed me to see things in terms of the blocks and to really think about the patch points. Kind of like with your modular synths, if you start using different colored cables, and I'm not saying I've done that here, but you could essentially get these very cheap, these alligator clips, cables, and you could start to, just use your yellows on one block or on one particular patch on your sound generation into the delay, use your red, your green in different ways. And to me, that was appealing. So when I look at what I've created here, it's a real opportunity to just see things visually so that if I'm creating a patch, I can get my head around that. I mean, one of the things that happens with modular synthesis is that you often are thinking about, what's going where and what's modulating what. And sometimes it gets into this point where you start to lose track of things. And that's part of the fun of modular, but it's also part of the challenge, because I think what happens is you can't always see what's going on, or you can't visualize what you're trying to accomplish. So this allows this as well. So essentially what I did was, once I had all my points laid out, I just, figure out how many I needed in each of the blocks on the conduit. I then had to feed these DuPont cables into the back, and I made pretty large, I don't know if you could see this. Just zoom in and focus for you here a little bit. So it's hard to see. If I have some other photos, I'll put it in post, but in the back there, I had to cut out rather large holes because in a lot of cases I'm trying to fit through 30 or upwards of 60 of the DuPont cables into the back, because essentially what I had to do then was to solder each of those onto one of my screws. These are what gives me the contact point, and everything of course is based on just having the metal touching metal, and that allows us to create a contact or to take one away to start modulation with one block into the next, or whatever it is that we want to do. So creating this actual board took a while, and I had to do some weighting on the back there because obviously there's a lot of weight going into this, and I was concerned about it falling over. So once I set this all up, it's pretty much a plug and play. And I think what I'll do is I will probably take the cables down and we'll just go through some of the sound possibilities, maybe some really simple patches. Again, I don't want to get into too much of focusing on the actual uses or functions of either conduit or resist. You can look online for more of those videos, but I just want to show you how this patch board that I've created works in tandem with the actual two units. And I should say, by the way, I mentioned Soma earlier doing the pipe. I saw that their latest drum machine design, the Pulsar 23, which is in prototype and I think coming out within a year, actually uses alligator clips and a similar setup. And the reason given by Vlad, their head designer and founder, is that it's cheaper. And so they can give more sonic manipulation possibility to the end user for a cheaper price, as opposed to using traditional patching through 1/8-inch jacks that we're maybe accustomed with most of our equipment. So anyway, enough talking. Let me show you some of the sonic possibilities here then.